It began as a sound no larger than a secret, a dry, rhythmic whisper from behind the master bedroom wall, like sand trickling through an unseen hourglass. Arthur first heard it on a Tuesday, a damp, clinging November Tuesday that seemed to press the grey sky flat against the skeletal fingers of the surrounding woods. He and Sarah had bought the house 3 months prior, a grand Victorian fixer-upper 6 miles outside the sleepy town of Oakhaven. It was meant to be their reset, a fortress of solitude built from high ceilings, intricate crown moulding, and the promise of quiet. They had fled the city's cramped chorus for the symphony of the woods, for a space large enough to finally start the family they'd so often sketched out in late-night conversations. But old houses carry their own weight, their own memories, and this one seemed to exhale a different history when the sun went down. The quiet they had purchased was of a different sort entirely. It was a listening quiet, a waiting quiet. Arthur lay perfectly still in bed, the warmth of his wife a distant comfort. The sound was there again, a faint, insistent scraping. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was methodical, too methodical for a branch against the siding. He nudged Sarah, his own breathing hitched. Her response was a murmur, thick with sleep, a dismissal wrapped in reassurance. "Mice," she mumbled, turning over. "Put out traps tomorrow." He did. The next morning, under a stubbornly overcast sky, he drove into Oakhaven and bought 6 classic snap traps. He baited them with thick, fragrant peanut butter, placing them with the precision of a surgeon along the baseboards of the master bedroom. He imagined the satisfying, definitive crack that would end the nightly disturbance. But 3 days bled into 4, and then a week, and the traps remained untouched. The peanut butter sat in perfect, alluring dollops, monuments to his failed logic. The silence from the traps was a mockery, because the sound from the wall was growing louder. It had shed its whisper, and was now a confident scratching. It was no longer the random, frantic skittering of a panicked rodent. It was slow, deliberate, and chillingly localized. Scritch, pause, drag, pause. It was the sound of something patient, something working. By the second week, the sound had begun to travel. It migrated from the bedroom wall, inching its way down the long, shadowed hallway that led to Arthur's home office. The house was a balloon frame, a relic of a bygone construction era where the spaces between the walls were hollow, continuous channels from the foundation to the attic. He'd read about it in one of his restoration manuals, an architectural curiosity. Now the knowledge felt sinister. Those hollow spaces were a network, a dark circulatory system. One night, unable to work, unable to think, Arthur stood in that hallway just after midnight. The only light came from the moon, filtered through the tall, wavy glass of the window at the far end. He pressed his ear against the aged floral wallpaper. The pattern faded into a pastel ghost. The plaster beneath was cold, not just cool, but unnaturally frigid, as if it were leaching warmth from his very skin. He held his breath and listened. Inside the wall, he heard it. It wasn't just scraping anymore. There was a wet, faint inhalation, a sound like air being pulled slowly through a saturated sponge. It was followed by the soft, heavy shifting of something dense against the interior studs. It was the sound of a body. Arthur's own foolishness felt like a shield as he spoke to the wall. "Is anyone there?" The words hung in the dead air, small and absurd. The scraping stopped. Instantly. The silence that followed was absolute. a profound and sudden void that was more terrifying than the noise it replaced. Then, 3 inches from his ear, a knuckle tapped back against the plaster from the inside. Knock, knock. It wasn't an echo. It was a reply. Arthur threw himself backward, a strangled cry caught in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, malevolent stillness of the house. He scrambled down to the cold, damp basement, his mind a white-hot blank of panic. His hand closed around the heavy, familiar weight of a claw hammer from his toolbox. He would tear it down. He would rip the wall open and expose whatever abomination was playing games with him. He stormed back up the stairs, the hammer a talisman against the fear. But when he reached the hallway, he stopped. Sarah was standing there in her thin nightgown, a fragile silhouette against the amber glow of the chandelier she had insisted on turning on. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the wall. "Arthur, don't," she whispered, her voice a thin, trembling thread. "Sarah, you don't understand. There's something in there. It tapped back at me." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "I know," she said, her voice barely audible. "It talked to me this afternoon, while you were at the hardware store." A spike of ice-cold dread shot down Arthur's spine, freezing the rage in his veins. "What do you mean, talked to you? What did it say?" Sarah shook her head, her gaze dropping to the ornate baseboard. "It doesn't use words," she said, her eyes wide with a horror he was only just beginning to comprehend. "It uses memories. It hums, Arthur, from right behind the drywall in the pantry. It hums the lullaby my mother used to sing to me, the one she sang the night before she died. That night, sleep was a forgotten country. They sat on the new living room sofa, a piece of furniture that still smelled of the showroom, of a life that now felt like a distant dream. They turned on every light in the house, a futile bulwark against the encroaching dark. They held hands, their palms slick with sweat, listening. The sound was no longer confined to a single wall. It was on the move, a restless tenant exploring its domain. They could track its progress through the hollow arteries of their home, pacing the perimeter like a caged animal. A dry scrape from the dining room, a heavy drag along the wall behind the staircase. Scritch, drag, scritch. It was a sound that was slowly, methodically, dismantling their sanity. By morning, bleary-eyed and raw, Arthur called a contractor. The man's name was Hank, a burly, reassuringly competent local with a sun-weathered face and hands like worn leather. He took one look at the house's layout, listened to Arthur's strained explanation, and nodded knowingly. "These old balloon frame houses," Hank explained, his voice a gravelly baritone. He pulled a moisture meter from his belt. Continuous studs running from the sill plate all the way to the attic. No fire stops, no insulation breaks. A stray cat or a big raccoon gets in the crawl space. It can roam the entire perimeter of your home behind these walls. Happens all the time. He pressed his meter against the plaster in the hallway, where Arthur had heard the tapping. Probably got itself stuck and panicked. "It's not a cat," Arthur said, the words flat and dead in the air. Hank grunted, his attention on the device in his hand. He frowned. The digital readout on the meter glitched, the numbers flickering erratically before the screen went blank. He slapped the device against his palm a few times. Strange. Battery was fine this morning. He leaned in closer to the wall, squinting at the baseboard, his professional demeanor momentarily cracking. "Hey, what kind of insulation did you say the previous owner put in here?" "None," Arthur said. "It's all original plaster and lath. empty cavities. Hank's gaze lingered on the wall. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before he masked it with a professional grunt. He pulled a small, curved pry bar from his tool belt. "Let's just take a peek. Won't make much of a mess." He wedged the tip of the bar beneath the baseboard where the wall met the floor. With a sharp, protesting groan of old nails, a 6-inch strip of wood popped free. It left a tiny, dark crevice, a black seam between the faded plaster and the aged oak floorboards. Hank knelt, clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight, and shined its powerful, focused beam into the gap. He froze. The silence that fell over the hallway was absolute. It was heavier than the night before. It was a vacuum that pulled the air from Arthur's lungs. Even the motes of dust dancing in the light from the window seemed to hang suspended. "Hank?" Sarah's voice was a fragile whisper. Hank didn't move. He remained crouched, the flashlight beam fixed on the darkness within the wall. Then slowly, as if moving through deep water, he lowered the flashlight. The beam swung down, casting a frantic, bouncing circle on the floor. His face, when he looked up, had been wiped clean of all its color. His skin had taken on a waxy, grayish tint, the color of old parchment. Without a single word, he began packing his tools back into his heavy canvas bag, his movements jerky and automatic. "I'm not taking this job," he said. The voice was his, but the tone was clipped, flat, and utterly devoid of its earlier confidence. He wouldn't meet Arthur's eyes. "What did you see?" Arthur demanded, his voice rising. He stepped forward, grabbing Hank's thick forearm. "Hank, look at me. What was in there?" Hank ripped his arm away with a strength that was shocking. For the first time, he looked directly at them, and his eyes were wide with a primal, bottomless terror. "Call a priest," he rasped, "or call a wrecker. But for God's sake, do not cut into those walls." He scrambled toward the front door, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. "If you break that plaster," he yelled back over his shoulder, his hand fumbling with the doorknob, "you give it an opening." Before Arthur could form a reply, Hank had wrenched the door open and bolted outside, slamming it shut behind him. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. A moment later, his truck engine roared to violent life, the sound of tires tearing up the gravel driveway, a scream of pure flight. That night, the house stopped pretending. As dusk bled the last of the color from the sky, Arthur and Sarah sat in stunned silence. Hank's words were a death sentence for their dream. They were prisoners in their own home, trapped between a mortgage and a nightmare. At midnight, with a low groan that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the house, the electricity died. It wasn't a simple click of a breaker. It was a slow, agonizing fade, the lights flickering, browning, and finally surrendering to a darkness that was thick, suffocating, and absolute. Arthur's fumbling hands found a flashlight on the mantelpiece. Sarah found another in the kitchen drawer. They clicked them on, but the beam seemed weak, swallowed by the heavy, oppressive air. Then came the smell. It didn't waft in from an open window. It leaked through the electrical outlets, a foul, coppery stench of iron and damp earth. Underneath it was a deeper, more nauseating scent, the smell of decaying hair and old, wet rot. It was the smell of the grave. The scraping sound did not return. The silence it left behind was worse. They stood in the living room, their weak flashlight beams cutting useless holes in the profound black. The cold was no longer just in the walls. It was pouring into the room, a deep, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the November air. It was a cold that seeped into their bones, making their teeth ache. And then a new sound began. It was soft, but it sliced through the silence with surgical precision. It was the sound of Sarah's lullaby. But this time, it wasn't humming. It was being whistled, a dry, airy tune coming from the far corner of the living room, from the wall behind the empty bookcase. After a few bars, it stopped. A moment passed. Then a new tune began, a different whistle, a jaunty, off-key melody Arthur hadn't heard in 30 years. The little song he used to whistle to himself as a boy when he was walking past the cemetery on his way home from school. A secret song for bravery he had never told another living soul. It knew him. It had been listening. It was learning. The whistling stopped. For a full minute, the only sound was their own ragged breathing, visible as frantic clouds in their flashlight beams. Then, from directly above their heads, came a new noise. Not a scrape, not a whistle. It was a soft, wet tearing. The sound of old wallpaper peeling away from saturated plaster. Plaster dust, fine and white as bone, began to drift down from the ceiling, shimmering in the twin beams of their lights. It was a gentle, horrifying snow. The tearing sound grew louder, wetter. It was punctuated by a soft, cracking pop. Then another. It was breaking through. The very thing Hank had warned them against, the one thing they were supposed to prevent, was happening. On its own. And they were right underneath it.